Granite County, Montana Territory, August 1888. The heat was a liar. It was a temporary tyrant, loud and boastful, beating down on the dust of the main street and making the very air shimmer above the dry grasses. But everyone who had lived through a single season here knew the truth. The heat was a fleeting guest. The cold was the landlord. And the rent was always due. Rhys Evans knew this better than most, though he had only been in Granite County for 2 years. He felt the coming winter not as a prediction, but as a memory. It was a phantom ache in the bones of his soul, a recollection of the damp, penetrating chill of the Welsh coal mines he had left behind. He had come to America for the promise of open sky and clean air, a place to raise his son, David, far from the coal dust that had taken his wife and so many others. But he had traded one form of darkness for another. Here, the darkness was not underground. It was a season that could last for 6 months. A season of profound, world-ending cold that seemed intent on erasing every trace of life from the landscape. He was an outsider, marked by an accent that was thicker than molasses and a quietness that the boisterous townsfolk mistook for dim-wittedness. He was the Welshman, the widower. He and his 7-year-old son lived in a small cabin on a plot of land a mile from town, a structure that had been thrown together with more haste than skill by the previous owner. Its walls were a lattice of gaps chinked with mud and moss that was already crumbling. The stone fireplace was a monstrosity of poor draftsmanship, a gaping maw that consumed firewood with ravenous inefficiency and gave back only a meager circle of warmth, leaving the corners of the single room to the mercy of the frost. Last winter had been a brutal education. Rhys had spent every waking moment feeding the fire, and every dollar he earned on firewood, watching it turn to smoke and ash, with precious little heat to show for it. He and David had lived in a constant state of shivering, huddled under every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the air inside their own home. They had survived. That was the only word for it. They had not lived. He would not allow his son to endure another winter like that. He could not afford it, physically or financially. The price of cordwood was already climbing, a barometer of the communal anxiety that settled over the valley as the days began to shorten. He stood on his small porch, looking not at the mountains, but at the ground beneath his feet. He felt the faint, residual warmth of the August sun on the packed earth. In the mines, he knew, the temperature was constant. Winter or summer, 100 feet down, the earth held its own steady warmth, a deep and abiding heat that had nothing to do with the sun. It was the memory of a million summers trapped in the rock. The miners would descend from a world of biting frost into a place of perpetual, gentle warmth. They didn't bring the heat with them. They descended into it. The rock itself was the stove. A sink can also be a source. The thought came to him with the clarity of a chapel bell. Heat, like water, flows from where it is to where it is not. A fireplace was a fire, yes, but it was also a hole. A massive, inefficient hole in the wall that let the cold rush in as the heat rushed out. It heated the air, and the air, thin and flighty, gave up its warmth in an instant. It was like trying to carry water in a sieve. You didn't heat the air. You heated the mass. You heated the stone. You made the smoke pay for its passage. That evening, he lit a single candle and sat with David at their rough-hewn table. He unrolled a piece of butcher paper and, with a nub of charcoal, began to draw. It was not the drawing of a house. It was the drawing of a lung. A complex, branching network of tunnels, all leading from a single point, a small, efficient-looking box, and twisting through a large, dense shape that filled the center of the page. "What is it, Da?" David asked, his small finger tracing one of the charcoal lines. "It's a way to stay warm, my boy," Reese said, his voice low. "It's a way to trap the summer." The next morning, he did not take his axe to the woods. He took a shovel and a pick to his cellar. The existing cellar was little more than a shallow pit for storing root vegetables, lined with loose field stones. He began to dig. The work was brutal, punishing. He was not a young man, and the mines had taken their toll on his back and lungs. But he worked with a methodical, unyielding rhythm born of grim necessity. The sound of his pick striking rock and his shovel scraping earth became the new pulse of his homestead. He was expanding the cellar, digging it deeper and wider, clearing a space roughly 10 feet by 12 feet and a full 6 feet deep. The pile of excavated earth grew into a small mountain behind his cabin. The townspeople, riding past on their way to hunt or trade, would see the strange mound and the quiet Welshman, smeared with dirt, hauling buckets of earth from beneath his own home. They did not see him chopping wood. By September, the digging was done. His hands were raw, his body a single, unified ache. But the whole was complete. Then came the second, even more bewildering phase of his plan. He hitched his old mule to his small wagon and began making trips to the river 2 miles away. He did not return with fish or timber. He returned with rocks. Not just any rocks. He was specific. He chose smooth, dense, water-worn stones, mostly granite and basalt, ranging in size from a loaf of bread to a small melon. He knew from his mining days that these stones, with their tight crystalline structures, were excellent conductors and retainers of heat. He avoided porous sandstone or crumbly shale. He was choosing his bricks for a furnace no one else could see. Day after day, the wagon creaked back to the cabin, laden with stone. He would unload them by hand, carrying or rolling each one into the house and down a heavy wooden ramp into the waiting cellar. The pile of rocks in his cellar began to grow, a strange subterranean cairn built with an unknown purpose. It was Thomas Abernathy who finally broke the wall of communal silence. Abernathy was the closest thing Granite County had to an architect. He had built the church, the general store, and half a dozen of the most solid-looking log homes in the valley. He was a man who understood angles, loads, and the properties of wood. He was a man whose certainty was as solid and square as the cabins he built. He rode up to Reese's property one afternoon, dismounting from his horse with the air of a man arriving to condemn a faulty structure. "Evans," Abernathy said, his voice not unkind but heavy with authority. He gestured with a gloved hand toward the quiet cabin. "The folks in town are talking. They say you've lost your senses. They say you spend your days hauling rocks and your nights digging. I see no new cordwood stacked. Winter is not a forgiving creditor, man." Reese leaned on his shovel, wiping sweat and dust from his brow with the back of his arm. He simply nodded, waiting. "What is this foolishness?" Abernathy pressed, stepping closer. "They're calling it Evans' Folly. You're digging your own grave in that cellar and filling it with stones. You and that boy will freeze before the new year if you don't start logging now. Time is running out." "I am preparing for winter, Mr. Abernathy," Reese said, his Welsh accent making the simple words sound foreign and strange. Abernathy scoffed, a short, sharp burst of disbelief. "Preparing? By filling your cellar with river rocks? Man, you need a proper woodpile and a fire that breathes. That little stove of yours won't heat a shoebox, and whatever heat it makes will go right up the chimney, same as any other. You're building a rock coffin for yourself." This was the moment. The confrontation between the old, trusted way and the new, incomprehensible one. Reese looked at the bigger man, at the confidence in his eyes, the certainty that came from a lifetime of doing things one way. Reese felt no anger, only a quiet, weary resolve. He straightened up, his gaze steady. "A chimney is a thief," Reese said softly. "It steals the heat before the house can use it." He paused, looking toward his cabin as if he could see the invisible system within. "I'm building a toll road. The smoke will have to pay rent before it is allowed to leave." Abernathy stared, his face a mask of confusion and pity. "Pay rent? Smoke? That's madness. You're talking in riddles while your boy's life is on the line." "Heat rises, Evans. It's the first rule. You build a fire, the heat goes up. Simple as that. You can't argue with physics." "I am not arguing with it," Reese replied. "I am negotiating the terms." He was not wrong. Thomas Abernathy shook his head and turned away, mounting his horse in a single, fluid motion. He looked back down at the smaller man covered in dirt. "Don't come to me for lumber or credit in January when you're freezing. I'm warning you now, as a decent man. Stop this madness." He rode off, leaving Reese alone in the long shadows of the afternoon. The encounter solidified his status. He was no longer just the quiet Welshman. He was the fool on the hill, the madman digging his own grave. The community, taking its cue from its most respected builder, now watched him with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They were waiting for winter to prove them right. The narrative of Reese Evans and his folly was now set in stone, much like the ones he continued to pile in his cellar. But what the people of Granite County saw as madness was, in fact, a deeply intuitive and elegant application of physics. Thomas Abernathy was correct when he said that heat rises. That is the principle of convection, the movement of heat through a fluid, like air or water. A conventional fireplace or wood stove is a convection engine. It heats the air directly in front of it. That hot air, being less dense, rises and escapes up the chimney, pulling cold air in from every crack and crevice in the house to replace it. This is why you can be sweating in front of a roaring fire while your back remains cold. The fire is fighting a constant battle against the drafts it itself creates. It is an engine of immense waste, sending, by some estimates, up to 90% of its energy into the sky. It is a machine designed to burn wood, not to heat a home. Reese understood this waste. He was not interested in heating the air. Air is a thermal pauper. It holds little heat and gives it away instantly. He was interested in heating mass. This is the principle of thermal mass, the ability of a material to absorb, store, and later radiate heat. A dense, heavy material like stone or water is a thermal millionaire. It absorbs heat slowly, holds it for a very long time, and releases it slowly and evenly. A log cabin, for all its rustic charm, has very little thermal mass. The logs themselves are decent insulators, but they don't store significant heat. The moment the fire goes out, the house begins its rapid descent to the outside temperature. Reese's cellar was not a pile of rocks. It was a battery, a thermal battery, and he was about to spend the autumn charging it. His system was built around three principles of heat transfer: conduction, convection, and radiation. By early October, the rock pile was complete. It filled most of the cellar, a tightly packed mass of over 20 tons of river granite, with a narrow walkway left around the edge. It was a solid, dense core at the heart of his home. Then, he began the second part of the construction, the flue. He had purchased a small, airtight cast-iron stove, a model known for its efficiency and slow burn rate. He installed it on the main floor of the cabin, but he did not vent it straight up through the roof. Instead, he routed the stovepipe down through the floor and into the cellar. There, he connected it to a winding, serpentine channel he had painstakingly built through the very center of the rock pile. This was his toll road. The channel was constructed of durable clay pipe, sealed at the joints with rock-hard mortar. It twisted and turned through the rock mass for nearly 40 feet, a convoluted labyrinth for the hot smoke and exhaust gases. Only after this long journey did the flue finally exit the rock pile, travel up through a corner of the cabin, and out a small, unassuming chimney on the roof. This design forced the hot exhaust from the stove, which in a normal cabin would be immediately lost to the sky, to travel in direct contact with the dense core of his thermal battery. This was conduction. The hot gases, which could be anywhere from 300 to 600 degrees Fahrenheit, transferred their energy directly into the clay pipe, which in turn transferred it into the surrounding rocks. The smoke was being stripped of its heat, forced to pay the rent that Reese had spoken of. By the time the exhaust finally exited the chimney, it was so cool you could almost hold your hand over it. He was harvesting nearly all of the energy from his firewood, not just the radiant heat from the firebox. He ran the stove day and night through the mild days of October and into the crisp chill of November. He burned wood slowly, keeping a small, hot fire going around the clock. He was not trying to heat the cabin's air. He was methodically, patiently, pouring heat into the 20-ton mass of stone beneath his floorboards. At first, there was no noticeable difference. But after a week, the floor near the stove began to feel faintly warm to the touch. After 2 weeks, the entire floor of the small cabin was pleasantly, inexplicably warm. David started taking off his shoes the moment he came inside, enjoying the gentle heat that seemed to rise from the very foundations of the house. This was the second principle at work: radiation. The massive, warm rock pile was now slowly releasing its stored energy. It wasn't blowing hot air. It was radiating thermal energy in all directions, like a miniature, subterranean sun. This radiant heat warmed every surface it touched: the floorboards, the walls, the furniture, the people within the space. It was a deep, pervasive warmth that didn't create drafts or cold spots. The entire cabin was becoming a gentle, low-temperature oven, with the heat source being the floor itself. The air temperature was not high, but the radiant temperature was comfortable, the kind of warmth that feels natural and settles deep in your bones. Finally, he addressed the problem of the cabin itself. He spent weeks sealing every crack, every seam, with a mixture of clay, sand, and straw. He built heavy wooden shutters for the inside of the windows. He was turning his home into a thermos, a well-insulated box designed to hold the heat his battery was now producing. This controlled the final piece of the puzzle: convection. By minimizing air leaks, he stopped the cycle of cold drafts that plagued every other home in the valley. The warm, still air inside his cabin stayed inside. By the first week of December, the first true snows had fallen. The temperature was dropping steadily below freezing at night. Reese went down into the cellar. He placed his hand on the central mass of rocks. They were not hot, but deeply and profoundly warm, like a beast sleeping through the winter. The battery was fully charged. He let the fire in the stove go out, and he did not light it again. The town watched. They saw the snow pile up around the Welshman's cabin. They saw the shutters go up over his windows. And crucially, they saw that no smoke ever came from his chimney. Not in the morning, not in the bitter cold of the evening. The chimney remained cold and lifeless. The conclusion was obvious and grim. Reese Evans had either frozen to death with his son, or he had given up and fled in the night. Abernathy felt a pang of guilt, wishing he had forced the man to listen. Others simply shook their heads at the tragic, predictable end of Evans's folly. January of 1888 arrived with a quiet, menacing cold. The old-timers felt it in their joints and looked to the sky, muttering about a breeder winter, one that was storing up its strength for a killing blow. They had no idea how right they were. The morning of January 12th dawned strangely. The sky had a sickly, yellow-gray pallor, and the air was unnaturally still and mild. Children went to school in light jackets. Farmers let their livestock out into the corrals. But by mid-afternoon, the world changed. A dark wall appeared on the northwestern horizon, a churning, bruised purple mass that moved with impossible speed. The temperature dropped not by degrees, but by tens of degrees, in minutes. A rancher who went out to check his herd later said it was like falling off a cliff. The air turned instantly, murderously cold. Then the wind hit. It was not a gale, it was a physical object, a solid wall of motion that carried with it a blinding, suffocating snow. It was not snow as people knew it, but a fine, gritty powder of ice, as sharp as sand, that penetrated every crack and seam. This was the schoolchildren's blizzard, a storm that would become a legend of terror on the plains. It caught the territory utterly by surprise. The world simply disappeared into a roaring, white chaos. Visibility dropped to zero. The sound of the wind was a constant, high-pitched scream that seemed to be tearing the very fabric of the sky apart. Inside Thomas Abernathy's solidly built home, the family was in a state of siege. He and his two sons worked in shifts, feeding massive logs into their huge stone fireplace. The fire roared, a desperate, hungry beast, its flames leaping up the chimney. Yet its heat barely reached the middle of the room. A thick layer of frost grew on the inside of the windows, spreading like a crystalline disease. The walls groaned under the assault of the wind. Abernathy's wife and daughter were huddled by the hearth, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their faces flushed from the direct heat of the fire, while their backs were chilled by the icy drafts that snaked across the floor. The woodpile, which Abernathy had believed would last until March, was shrinking at a terrifying rate. He was burning a month's worth of wood in a single week. And for what? To keep one small circle of his home barely habitable? He thought of his livestock, sealed in the barn. He prayed the structure would hold. He thought of his neighbors, and, with a sudden, sharp pang of dread, he thought of the Welshman and his boy. Whatever madness had possessed him, no man deserved to die like this, frozen in a dark cabin with a cellar full of useless rocks. A mile away, inside the cabin of the fool, a different world existed. There was no roaring fire. There was no screaming draft. There was only a profound and gentle silence, a quiet cocoon buffered from the raging storm outside. The shutters were sealed tight, the door barred. The only light came from a single oil lamp, which cast a warm, steady glow. Rhys Evans sat in a simple wooden chair, reading a book of Welsh poetry. His son David lay on a rug on the floor, contentedly piecing together a small wooden puzzle. They were in their shirt sleeves. The air in the cabin was perfectly still and held a steady, comfortable warmth. It was not hot, but it was the opposite of cold. It was a complete and total absence of chill. The source of this impossible comfort was beneath their feet. The 20-ton thermal battery, charged with the concentrated energy of a mild autumn, was now slowly, steadily, inexorably releasing its heat. It radiated warmth upwards through the floorboards, turning the entire floor into a single, massive, low-temperature radiator. The temperature inside the cabin held at a near-constant 65 degrees. The stones in the cellar, protected from the outside world by the earth itself, were oblivious to the blizzard. They knew only the slow, immutable laws of thermodynamics, giving back the heat they had so patiently stored. The house did not fight the storm, it simply ignored it. For 2 days and 2 nights, the blizzard raged. It was a storm that would be spoken of for generations, a benchmark for cold and ferocity. When the wind finally subsided and the sky reappeared, it revealed a world transformed, buried, and broken. The landscape was a sea of white, with drifts piled up to the rooftops. The official temperature was 40 degrees below zero, not accounting for the wind that still scraped and bit at any exposed skin. The town slowly, painfully, came back to life. Stories of loss began to circulate. Entire herds of cattle, frozen solid where they stood. Men who had been caught out in the storm, found just yards from their own doors. The church was turned into a refuge for families whose homes were too damaged or who had simply run out of firewood. The reality was stark. The storm was over, but the winter was not. No one had enough wood to survive another cold snap like that. A quiet desperation began to set in. Thomas Abernathy took stock of his own situation. His house was intact, his family safe, but his woodpile was a shadow of its former self. He had maybe 2 weeks of fuel left, if he rationed it carefully. He was a proud man, a man whose entire identity was built on his competence and foresight. And he had failed. His methods, the trusted and true ways of building, had been found wanting. The cold had breached his fortress with ease. It was on the 3rd day after the blizzard that one of his neighbors, struggling through a massive drift, mentioned something odd. He had passed by the Welshman's property. He had expected to see it buried, lifeless. But a clear path had been shoveled from the door to the small outhouse. And the chimney was still clear of snow. There was no smoke. There had been no smoke for weeks. The man assumed they had died long before the storm. But the shoveled path, that didn't make sense. Abernathy felt a strange, unsettling feeling, a crack in the foundation of his certainty. Riddles and madness. The smoke must pay rent. He had dismissed it as the ramblings of a fool. But what if it wasn't? Driven by a desperate need to know, to see for himself the tragic outcome he had predicted, he pulled on his heaviest coat and boots and began the long, arduous trek through the snow to Rhys Evans's cabin. The walk took him over an hour. The world was silent, muffled by the deep blanket of snow. As he got closer, he saw the cabin, looking small and vulnerable against the vast white expanse. He saw the shoveled path. He saw the dead chimney. He steeled himself for what he would find inside. He was a man of the community. He would see to it that the man and his boy got a proper burial. He reached the door and hesitated. He raised a heavy, mittened hand and knocked. The sound was flat and dead in the frozen air. He waited, expecting only silence. To his astonishment, he heard the sound of the bar being lifted from inside. The door creaked open a few inches. A sliver of warm, lamplit air washed over his face, a stunning, impossible contrast to the biting cold he was standing in. Rhys Evans stood there, looking out at him, his expression unreadable. He was wearing a simple woolen shirt, not a heavy coat. Behind him, Abernathy could see the boy, David, playing on the floor, looking healthy and safe. Abernathy was speechless. His mind could not reconcile what his senses were telling him. He had come to find a tomb, and he had found a sanctuary. The wave of gentle, stable warmth that flowed from the cabin was more shocking than any blast of cold. "Evans," he stammered, his breath fogging in the air between them. You are alive." "As you see, Mr. Abernathy," Rhys said quietly. "Will you come in?" Rhys opened the door wider. Abernathy stepped across the threshold, and it was like entering another season. The cold fell away from him instantly, replaced by a pervasive, even warmth that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. There was no fire. The small cast-iron stove was cold to the touch. He looked around the simple, clean room, his builder's eye taking in the sealed windows, the lack of any visible drafts. His gaze fell to the floor. Reese watched him, saying nothing. Abernathy, moving as if in a trance, knelt down and placed his bare palm flat against the wooden floorboards. They were warm. Not hot, but distinctly, undeniably warm. A deep, resonant warmth that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the earth. He crawled over to the stone foundation wall that was exposed in one corner of the cabin and placed his hand on it. It, too, was warm. In that moment, the full, crushing weight of his ignorance and the brilliant, simple truth of what Reese had done crashed down upon him. He had been so certain, so loud in his conviction, and he had been so completely, profoundly wrong. He looked up at Reese, his eyes filled with a humility he had never known. The pride that had defined him was gone, burned away by the silent, gentle heat of this impossible room. He did not ask for firewood. He did not ask for shelter. He asked the only question that mattered. How? Reese Evans pulled up a second chair. He sat down opposite the town's most respected builder, the man who had mocked him and called him a fool. He looked at Abernathy not with triumph, not with condescension, but with the quiet empathy of a fellow survivor. And he began to explain. He spoke of the mines in Wales, of the deep, constant heat of the earth. He spoke of thermal mass, of conduction, of making the heat a resident in the home, not a temporary visitor. He spoke of storing the memory of the sun in stone. That spring, when the great thaw finally came, Thomas Abernathy did not begin work on a new log cabin. He appeared at Reese Evans's property with his tools and his 2 sons. He was not a teacher. He was a student. Together, they spent the summer digging. They dug new cellars for 3 families whose homes had been ravaged by the winter. They hauled river rock and laid winding flues, with Abernathy applying his construction expertise to perfect Reese's intuitive design. They called them Evans Cellars at first, then Welsh Heaters. The idea spread through the county and then beyond. It was a revolution born not of new technology, but of ancient, forgotten wisdom. It was the principle of the Roman hypocaust and the Korean ondal, rediscovered by a quiet Welsh miner in the heart of the Montana wilderness. The designs saved countless lives in the harsh winters that followed, a legacy of warmth built on a foundation of humility. Years later, after Reese had passed, his son David found a small journal. On the last page, written in a steady, careful hand, was a final entry. They all saw me hauling stones and thought I was a fool filling my cellar with rocks. They did not understand. I was not filling it with rocks. I was filling it with stored sunlight and the warmth of 100 summer days. Fire is not the gift. Heat is the gift, and the wisest among us know how to keep it. The world is full of conventional wisdom, of established experts who tell you that heat only rises, that things must be done the way they have always been done. They point to their roaring, wasteful fires as proof of their success, even as the cold creeps in around them. They will laugh at you for digging in your own cellar, for collecting stones while they are chopping wood. What about you? What forgotten wisdom, what counterintuitive truth lies dormant within your own experience? What overgrown entrance to a better way are you walking past every day, simply because no one else has ever thought to clear the path? Your cave is there. Your stones are waiting. Perhaps it is time to stop feeding the fire and start warming the house. This story is a historically inspired reconstruction. The characters are fictional, and their actions are a composite of historical practices and principles of thermal engineering. The content is for inspirational and illustrative purposes and does not constitute professional architectural or engineering advice. Always consult with qualified professionals before undertaking any construction project.